Today on MCJ's Startup Series, our guest is Julia Reichelstein, CEO and co-founder at Vaulted Deep. Vaulted is a carbon removal company that injects carbon-rich waste slurries deep underground into permanent geologic storage. They've come onto the scene quite fast, recently securing just north of a $58 million order from Frontier to sequester a bit over 152,000 tons of carbon between now and 2027, which is Frontier's largest commitment yet. They're one of 20 finalist teams still in the mix for the $100 million Carbon Removal X Prize, and they're one of 24 semifinalists of the DOE's Carbon Dioxide Removal Purchase Pilot Prize. Try saying that 3 times fast. They also recently announced an $8 million seed round led by Lowercarbon Capital with participation from Earthshot, Woven Earth, Collaborative Fund, and others. We got to know Julia and her co-founder, Omar Abou-Sayed, as they were setting up Vaulted as a spin-out of Omar's waste disposal company, Advantek. Vaulted is a complex set of operations based on a relatively simple construct. Humans have been sucking geologically stored carbon in the form of oil out of the ground for 150 years now. What if we could put it back? And we talk about all this and more. But before we start, I'm Cody Sims.
I'm Yin Lu.
And I'm Jason Jacobs. And welcome to My Climate Journey.
This show is a growing body of knowledge focused on climate change and potential solutions.
In this podcast, we traverse disciplines, industries, and opinions to better understand and make sense of the formidable problem of climate change and all the ways people like you and I can help. Julia, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Cody. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, boy, I'm excited to have this conversation because as you and I were chatting about just before we hit record, your 2 facilities for Vaulted that are live today are 2 places that are near and dear to my heart, Los Angeles, where I live, and Hutchinson, Kansas, which is where my wife is from, and I have been to more times than I can count. And who would have thought that a company pioneering underground carbon waste sequestration, I'm sure I'm not saying it the way I'm supposed to, has its roots in 2 places that are very close to my own life?
Oh, yeah, Cody. You know, we aim to personalize carbon removal, so did it for you.
Let's start there. How in the world did you land on Los Angeles and Hutchinson, Kansas as being your first 2 sites?
Is it helpful we just start sort of walking through the history of Vaulted? Because I think it really kind of paints the picture. So at the highest level, as you mentioned, Vaulted is a carbon removal company. We take organic waste, so sludgy, carbon-intensive organic waste, so plant matter. We let plants capture that carbon. They do it really well through photosynthesis. That carbon is then useful in the economy, right? A human eats it, a cow eats it. Somehow it ends up as sludgy organic waste. Think organic waste like biosolids, manures, food and ag waste, paper sludge, anything that's like moisture intensive, aggregated already by existing industries. Then we take that waste and instead of letting it go back out to be put in a landfill or incinerated or spread on land to decompose, we take it and basically when it's at the end of its life, we take it and we put it deep underground for permanent sequestration. So we are a permanent carbon removal company. We're talking like 3,000 plus feet underground, really deep underground for permanent storage. And really the core of the company is kind of that slurry injection technology that we use to put it underground and store it safely. But that was a kind of high level, but the history of Vaulted is sort of an interesting one because we just became a carbon removal company. We just became an official company in August of last year. So we're less than a year old as a company, but it's a little bit misleading because there's been sort of decades of work behind the company that we've built now and behind Vaulted. So maybe I'll give you a little bit of an intro on myself and then on my co-founder, because Vaulted is sort of the 2 of us coming together in some ways. So for me, I'm Julia. I'm co-founder and CEO of Vaulted. I'm actually coming from a pretty different background. So I spent the first big chunk of my career in international development. I worked in Peru and then I lived in Kenya for nearly 5 years, helping build a fintech that did alternative data credit scoring. So nothing to do with climate change, but really sort of how do you work with large commercial banks to help them understand risk on their unbanked portfolios and try to increase formal financial access for unbanked populations in emerging markets, which was really exciting work. I mean, I figured out a couple of things. One, I loved working at startups and building things. And then 2 was, I got to work with a lot of smallholder farmers, especially in East Africa. We were doing sort of like parametric crop insurance products on the fintech side, and just seeing like really intensely the effect of climate change today. I was working with this smallholder farmer in Western Ethiopia and was like going through this very complicated parametric insurance products and payouts and all this. And I just remember he was like, after months of working together, he looked at me and he was like, "That's nice, Julia, but there's no rain." Like it hadn't rained in like 6 years. So we were in the 7-year drought in East Africa at the time. I had this moment of like, whoa, yeah, that is the real kind of core of some of this work. And sort of if you care about global poverty, if you care about development work, then you have to be thinking about climate change because, in my opinion, it's the biggest driver. It's going to be the biggest driver of global poverty in our lifetimes. And it was a big, like, I don't know, growing up in the US, I think I always heard like climate change will come and it will be bad. And it was like, no, climate change is here and it is bad. And it's really bad for a lot of people.
Yeah. Oftentimes in places that if you're living in Los Angeles or even Hutchinson, Kansas, you may not see it firsthand.
And what that means in terms of different weather patterns, what that means in terms of different pests, what that means in terms of food security. I mean, if you're a smallholder farmer and you don't have rain for 7 years, it's really hard to eat. It's just incredibly heartbreaking to see. And it really put me on a different trajectory. I studied economic development and statistics and undergrad, and sort of it put me on a whole different career trajectory. So I went to business school and then really kind of pivoted into climate. I was a venture capitalist at Piva Capital for a couple of years. Piva is a now $500 million fund, really focused on sort of climate and deep tech investing, but it was a fantastic experience. I got to see, a bunch of different climate technologies and sort of understand how that space is developing, but really got lucky because I kind of got to start in 2020 when carbon removal was really taking off. Like it was the early days of a lot of these now I'm going to put in quotes, household names of carbon removal, right? So I got to see across a number of different approaches what folks were doing in terms of how do you capture it efficiently, how do you process it efficiently, how do you store it efficiently, and how do you do that at scale and low cost, which was just really a great standpoint to be in or viewpoint to have in the market. And it's actually, I'm going to just give a shout out to you guys. The MCJ was really a huge part of my life, especially as an investor. I used to listen to the episodes every single week. Before I'd go talk to, the company and hear the pitch, I would go and listen to the episode and get smart beforehand. So,
well, that's great to hear. We have a lot of episodes. So at least someone's listening to them. Thank you.
No, this is maybe an overshare, but I literally had a routine where I'm a runner. So I'd run every morning. And before the pitches of that day, I'd go and I'd go and like find that CEO or that, company's episode and listen. So I'd get smart before I go talk to them.
Amazing. Glad to hear it. And we did actually just add filters to our website because the episode page was getting a little bit overwhelming. And now you can filter by sector, by topic, etc. So that there are ways to find the little categories of episodes that you may be looking for in the future.
Oh, very cool. I'm excited for that. Anyway, that was my shout out. But yeah, basically got to see sort of carbon removal as a whole. And it was from really that standpoint where I was having this feeling of like, I only wanted to think about carbon removal. I really wanted to be in it. And so much so that I actually ended up deciding to leave investing, which was honestly a really scary decision. I mean, being a VC, as you know, is like a wonderful job. And I loved the team at Piva. And it was really hard to leave such a good job. And I just had this feeling of like, I really want to build something in carbon removal. And I feel like the time is now, just in the industry and how much it's taking off. And something about it felt, not to be cheesy, but like pretty right in the soul. I ended up leaving. And then I actually pretty quickly got connected to my co-founder, actually through Piva. That's a whole other story, but got connected to my co-founder, Omar Abou-Sayed. And he was working on something completely different. But maybe I can tell you a little about his company, because when I first met him, he was like, I've basically been building my company, Advantek. So Vaulted is a spinoff of Advantek Waste Management Services, which is Omar's company. That company, I'm going to take you on the other side of the relationship. We'll take you down to Omar's history. So Advantek really is a company built off of Omar's father's invention. So Omar's father is a fairly well-known geologist. He was one of the inventors of slurry injection. So actually in the 80s, out of the Clean Water Act, basically the EPA ruled that you can no longer leave oil field waste, right? All that like oily, rocky water when you drill for oil and gas. You can no longer just like leave that on the Earth's surface when you go and drill for oil and gas. And so they had to figure out sort of something to do with it, which was incredibly expensive, especially in sort of more remote environments. And so Omar's father and some of his contemporaries basically invented for the first time, how do you put solids underground, right? That slurry injection. How do you actually take that rocky, oily water, grind it up, and put it right back down underground, right? So you can sort of think about drilling a well near your production well and sequestering all of that carbon, putting it back where it came from, a little bit like cleaning up local environments and sort of cleaning up legacy industry.
Let me ask a couple questions on that so I understand, because I think Vaulted is where you're going to go with this, is you're leveraging some of that technology or much of that technology. I know there are all the different sort of classes of wells that are out there, class 6 wells, et cetera. Can you explain a little bit about what type of well we're talking about here? And is it like a concrete well underground, or are you simply putting it below the water table to where it's not going to leach into drinking water?
So for both of these, it's deep well pressurized injection. So deep well in general, think thousands of feet underground. So just to put in your head, like 1,000 feet is basically an Empire State Building. Mm-hmm. So multiple Empire State Buildings underground, really far underground. If we had visuals, I'd show my slide, which is like the water table, is usually in a couple hundred feet of the surface. And we're going way beneath that. And we're always sort of in that. We look for generally a basin structure, right? So we have some sort of confining interval, some sort of cap rock where it's really non-porous rock, like a shale, that's sort of capping that layer in. And then we're drilling beneath it and we're going into the basin structure. That basin structure is generally a more porous stone, like a sandstone. That porosity is actually what allows us to, at high pressures, dilate that pore space and push the waste into the pore space as we inject.
So this is not a constructed physical well that you're putting steel and cement and stuff into to hold. You're actually just drilling deep into the Earth's surface, but you're doing it at a depth where there is not impact on things that life depends on, I guess.
No, so there's definitely a well.
There is a well.
There is a well, yes. I want to be very clear on that. There is a well. You can think about drilling the well, and then it's pipe and pipe design. So there's actually 2 pipes in there, plus cement to surface all the way up and down. So in the kind of geology world, that's like one of the highest integrity wells you can have, right? So you've got literally multiple layers of containment and insurance that there's not going to be any sort of, if there's like a crack in one pipe, we have the second pipe, and then we have the cement, right? So it's quite well solidified in there. And think about that whole structure. So those 2 pipes plus cement going all the way 3,000 feet or whatever it might be for that specific formation. But I think the thing to note is we're not like filling up that pipe. We're pushing the waste through the pipe at high pressures into the sandstone. So it's going in a plume around the well. And that's really where it's sort of that basin structure, right? So it's never leaving that basin structure. We have that natural geologic containment by picking the right formations. But we're sort of able to put, large amounts of waste. We generally think about formation capacity of like 2 million tons of waste, in any one wellbore that we drill.
So this was Omar's company, Advantek. His dad invented this technology to basically take this oil field waste and push it down into these wells. Presumably a big part of the technology here is what's the right geologic place to dig this well and how do you do it, I'm guessing. And so the actual, I assume, permitting and creation of these facilities is non-trivial.
Exactly. And it's a great point because actually a big part of the IP and the trade secrets and sort of the know-how that we've inherited from Advantek is in site selection and is in picking that right geology and making sure that you're actually doing, we call it feasibility studies, right, where you actually understand the subsurface, doing that in a really high integrity way, where you're looking at the well logs and you're understanding the formations and the capacity and the containment that it has. Because picking the right site is really important for maximizing waste capacity of the site, but then also ensuring containment, ensuring sort of safe operation. So it's a big part of what we do.
Back to the question I was asking around the fossil energy and carbon management classifications of wells, or maybe it's EPA classifications of well sites. Are these class 6 wells, just so I understand that, or is this something totally different?
Great question. So for us, it's class 5. So actually both of our facilities in your hometowns are all class 5, which is an experimental class of well. But we sort of work with the EPA and think about, being able to permit generally 10 to 15 sort of these types of wells under class 5 before you have enough instances to create its own class. So that could be a class 7 or class 8 one day, whatever class we're at. So it's a great call. So we're not class 6. So I'm sure maybe some people have heard about all of the complexities around class 6 permitting and sort of the backlog there. So we're not in that same queue. It's all sort of class 5 permitted, but still, fully regulated by the EPA.
And was Class 5 then originally created as an oil and gas waste management vehicle? At least I'm assuming, based on your origin story here.
Yeah, actually, sorry, that's a good call. So the Advantek wells are not class 5. So those are, I'm actually forgetting off the top of my head exactly what class those are in, but those are class 2,
Okay.
I want to say. No, so it's only the 2 wells we have, so LA and Kansas, which do it with organics. Those are class 5.
Okay, we just came full circle. I love it. So Advantek started as these oil waste wells. The company learned this methodology for drilling deep and finding the right geological subsurface in which to inject this oil field waste. And then at some point, you and Omar met and said, hey, maybe there's a carbon sequestration play here. And Vaulted was born of that. How did that happen?
Somewhat exactly. So when I met Omar, he was like, look, we own, 6 wells across the US, primarily, again, that same slurry injection in the oil field space. I would just also add the nuance that slurry injection is very hard to do. There's not that many players that do it. Most geologic injection is that pure gas or pure liquid. Uniform particle size to put it safely underground easily. It's easy to plug your well if you've got sort of the slurry, right? The solid laden liquid. It's quite hard to do that well at scale. And so really Advantek is a leading expert in slurry injection globally because they've shown time and time again that their technique and how to do it actually maximizes formation capacity and really doesn't plug your well. So they actually have taken wells from their peers that they plugged their well or they weren't being able to maximize their formation capacity and took it over and was really able to extend it. So that's sort of the history of Advantek and slurry injection. And when I met Omar, he was like, yeah, we have sort of these 6 wells across the US, primarily in the oil field space, except we have, and when he kind of was telling me about the oil field, I was a little bit like, that's nice. That's not anything, that's not my world, right? That's not what I'm focused on. And he's like, but let me tell you about this one site in the heart of Los Angeles. So in Terminal Island, the port of LA, so right next to Long Beach. And he was like, we've been owning and operating this site for the last 5 years as Advantek. It uses that same slurry injection technology, but really applied to organics for the first time. So we take about 20% of the city of LA's biosolids every year. This is post wastewater treatment facility, post aerobic and anaerobic digestion, human waste right from the wastewater treatment facility. We take about 20% of that and using that same technology, sort of put it right back down underground for permanent sequestration. And, the history of Tyre is a long one. I'm not sure we have time to do it full justice. But it was actually originally permitted to be sort of an experiment by the DOE to see if we could do downhole anaerobic digestion to produce biomethane, which was an interesting idea. I'll cut to the chase there. It's like over a decade, and there's been de minimis amounts of methane ever detected, like less than 25 kilograms ever detected at the wellbore. So a bit of a failure of biomethane production, honestly, but pretty good for permanent carbon removal that you're putting all that carbon deep underground. But when I met Omar, he was like, we're doing this. It was built for this experiment. We have this contractual minimum. And, everything we don't take, that 80%, gets trucked generally 300 miles round trip into the Central Valley. It's spread on land, primarily for the purpose of decomposition. There's a lot of regulations, obviously, of what you can do with biosolids applied land. So you can't grow like human food in it in California, for example. You can't grow like crops for consumption. Primarily decomposed.
A lot of it is dumped on crops that would animals then eat it as animal feed. Is that right?
Yeah, it could be a mix of either animal feed or just a non-productive land, like a grassland or like a desertification land.
Got it.
It's a mix depending on the specific geography. Everything when it goes back out there, a couple of things happen, right? It decomposes into a combination of CO2 and methane. We've looked at sort of the Central Valley. In general, there it's decomposing primarily into methane, like 70% into methane. So it's not great from the climate perspective of that decomposition. And then obviously anything that's in those biosolids or in those wastes are now like out into local groundwater. When you think about where the water table is, it's really close to the surface. So when we think about water contamination, anything that's getting land applied is going into groundwater. So if we think about PFAS, if we think about other pathogens, the Inspector General has a really interesting report that came out that's basically like there's 61 known pathogens, even in Class A treated biosolids that are hazardous for human health. It is clean land, air, water, environmental cleanliness perspective, and then also for the surrounding community, there's a community health implication as well. And if we think sort of even more broadly in the US and globally, right, there's a fairly big environmental justice component to this because this is very broad strokes, but generally where we dump waste in general, we think about where landfills are or where waste disposal sites are, those are generally near poor communities and communities of color. So they're disproportionately affecting marginalized communities. Maybe we can get into that in a little bit because I think it's a really interesting and part of the work that I'm really excited about. But that's all happening, right, when it goes back out to these local communities. And when I met Omar, he was like, we haven't really been able to scale. They never sold a carbon credit. Really, Advantek as a waste disposal company, we sort of realized that it was our two worlds coming together. My world and the carbon removal world would actually pay for permanent, measurable, high-quality carbon removal, and it really wasn't scaling as sort of a waste disposal solution alone. So it kind of needed those two things. We spent a year plus thinking about what the vision of Vaulted could be and realizing it's not just tipping fee paying waste, right? We can take all sorts of sludgy waste, some of which we'll pay for, some of which we'll get paid for, but it really means we have that full breadth of scale of flexibility of waste we can take, but also meant that we really were a carbon removal company now. And so we had to spin off. So it took us about a year to really think about what does that look like? How do you carve a company in two? We spun off from Advantek and then we raised our seed round. It was an $8 million seed round led by Lowercarbon Capital with participation from Earthshot and Collab and Woven Earth, a couple others. And so really kind of that catalyzed sort of spinning off, and now we're a completely separate standalone carbon removal company that goes after everything with organic waste in that sort of slurry injection technology.
So many questions that jump to mind. The first of which is, if the original business was getting paid to put stuff underground, you kind of didn't really care where the stuff came from. You care about how much of it you could put underground because you're getting paid for as much of it as you can put under there as possible. Now you have to think about the counterfactuals of like, okay, if this waste didn't go underground, where would it have gone and what would have happened? For example, if it was going to get laid on farmland that would grow animal feed, now is that farmland going to have to buy more fertilizer that has its own emissions footprints? Some of that sounds super complicated. How do you navigate through all of that? And how do you ensure that you aren't just trying to jam as much stuff underground as possible if it's not actually making a difference?
Yes, we look intensely at the counterfactual, right, of what would have happened, and we need strong evidence for what would have happened otherwise. When we go and look at new sources of waste, we're doing sort of this holistic calculation of that source of waste. So we really go in and we think about what's the carbon content of that waste? What's the counterfactual, right? So where did it go for the last 5 years? If they send it to a landfill, we're looking at, do you have your landfill, receipts? Go prove to us that you sent it to a landfill for the last 5 years. Or if you incinerated it on site, where's the burn pit proof, right? So all of that kind of stuff. We're really looking at what did happen over the last couple of years to that waste. Because we include that counterfactual in the LCA, that we think about a couple of different things on that counterfactual. We're fully, well, actually, let me go through my math a little bit. So it's carbon, what's the carbon content? What's the counterfactual? How far is it from the well? If we're trucking it, obviously any of those emissions, we account for transportation, any on-site processing emissions, and then sequestration monitoring. So full-bodied LCA, and we're fully audited by Isometric. They're a registry. Really excited to be working with Isometric. I've been frankly blown away by the level of quality that and rigor that they bring to kind of the LCA and the auditing process. So
I saw they just had two very prominent former MCJ podcasts join the team at Isometric, with Stacy Kauk from Shopify, who was at Frontier, and also Dr. Jennifer Wilcox from the DOE. Both joined Isometric within the last few weeks, it seems like, or at least announced it.
I'm really excited by sort of all of the work that they're doing in terms of they have a really strong team of scientists on the Isometric team. So they're really quite, quality and science focused and forward. But then they've also got a really strong commercial team as well, and just a team that thinks holistically about regulation and buyers, but also about how do we operationalize carbon removal at scale.
So they help you think through the different criteria of potential sources. If you have a new source of waste showing up, you'll run it by them and say, hey, we're thinking about being able to use this as removal tonnage. Does this make sense?
What we do is we're, again, fully on the protocol, which is public. I don't know if we can put links on here, but the protocol, so every single rule...
We can share them in the show notes.
Okay, every single rule that we follow is on on the protocol in terms of exactly how the LCA gets done, that math. I mean, in general, you can think about it like, again, what's that carbon content? And then you sort of subtract out all your emissions associated with it. And then there's a biomass accounting feedstock module, which is incredible. Honestly, I think the first of its kind that I've really seen, where it goes into detail on what we can and cannot take from a waste perspective. So we think about things like making sure we're not encouraging land use change. So we have to make sure that we're not incentivizing the production of waste, right? And there's a number of different ways that we sort of check that, improve that. We want to make sure that we're not replacing durable storage for other durable storage. So we have to prove that it would have decomposed within a number of years in the counterfactual, right? If there is counterfactual use, if it did go to some productive use, we have very clear rules on how you do that accounting. So if it would have gone to fertilizer, we of course then account for sort of someone else. If we get it, someone else then going and buying sort of more fossil fuel-based fertilizer. I think that's right from a planet perspective, because it means you actually are fully taking into account all of the effects of your carbon removal. What I also love about it, though, is it's actually, I'm a business person, so I kind of love incentives and alignment. It's like all I think about these days. But I love that it aligns our incentives, because if it is going to a productive use, then we have to account for that in our LCA. That ton of waste gets relatively more expensive. And so we are, by nature, incentivized to pick the wastes that are least productively used, because it's like a better waste to CDR ratio for us out of LCA in the first place.
Hey everyone, I'm Yin, a partner at MCJ Collective, here to take a quick minute to tell you about our MCJ membership community, which was born out of a collective thirst for peer-to-peer learning and doing that goes beyond just listening to the podcast. We started in 2019 and have grown to thousands of members globally. Each week, we're inspired by people who join with different backgrounds and points of view. What we all share is a deep curiosity to learn and a bias to action around ways to accelerate solutions to climate change. Some awesome initiatives have come out of the community. A number of founding teams have met, several nonprofits have been established, and a bunch of hiring has been done. Many early-stage investments have been made, as well as ongoing events and programming, like monthly Women in Climate meetups, idea jam sessions for early-stage founders, climate book club, art workshops, and more. Whether you've been in the climate space for a while or just embarking on your journey, having a community to support you is important. If you want to learn more, head over to mcjcollective.com and click on the Members tab at the top. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of the show.
The next set of questions I have, I think, hit on some of that, which is, all right, let's use the simplest, not simplest technically, but the simplest to understand form of carbon removal, which I think is probably direct air capture. There's too much CO2 in the atmosphere. We are going to suck some of it out and we're going to store it somewhere. There, you're taking stuff that's already atmospheric and you're removing it away and putting it somewhere. That's relatively easy to understand, I think. Then you start to think about some of the areas in the carbon credit world that have gotten on the hot seat a little bit, like forestry, where forestry, you're mostly calculating how many emissions are you avoiding by not cutting this tree down, because the tree would eventually, if cut down, release emissions from it and would absorb fewer emissions in the future from the air. It's very model-based as opposed to counting atoms-based. It is very rooted in counterfactuals as opposed to rooted in actuals. It sounds like you're somewhere in between these two things, but you're not removing atmospheric carbon. You're removing solid terrestrial carbon and avoiding it being released as atmospheric carbon in the future. But you're also moving atoms through to where you can count the actual number of tons of carbon moving through your system. So you're kind of in between. Is that a crazy way for me to think about how Vaulted works?
No, it's not crazy. There's a couple of different ways to slice that pie. The way I generally think about it is avoidance credits. So we think about the sort of the traditional carbon markets, which I think a lot of people know have had a somewhat fraught history in terms of quality. I think a big part of sort of the quality issues we've had on the traditional avoidance markets is because avoidance markets are by definition relying on a non-observable counterfactual. We're saying, I would have cut down that tree, but because you paid me, I didn't cut down that tree, but we obviously will never know if you would have cut down the tree or not.
Or how many actual emissions of CO2 that tree would have not absorbed and or would have released and or some combination of the two.
Exactly.
It's a lot of math to trust.
It's a lot of math. And I think that's kind of a great way of putting it. It's a lot of math. And so that was sort of one world, right? And then I think carbon removal really, from at least my perspective of the market when I was a VC at the time, really was born as a alternative to that lot of math and a lot of non-observable stuff and saying, hey, we can actually look at what carbon are we taking out of the atmosphere, how many emissions are associated with us taking it and processing it, and then where are we putting it and how do we monitor that? And we're like actually measuring exact things that we're doing. And so that is like an active process, as you said, and we're actively removing that carbon and storing it somewhere durably.
Actively removing it from the earth, you're not actively removing it from the atmosphere, just to make sure I'm understanding correctly how your process works.
This is a little semantic. It depends on where you draw the boundary line. If you draw the boundaries all the way up to like whoever planted those plants to capture it, then it is, and those plants obviously have captured the carbon from the atmosphere. So it was originally captured from the atmosphere. But you're completely correct. And like we think about like take ownership of that carbon when it's already in waste form. So we're not including all of the emissions from growing that plant in the first place and it moving through the whole industrial system. Like we don't do that part. We're really taking ownership of it. And that boundary starts when it's already organic waste, already in plant form and about to go be sent to landfill. So exactly right. So we're sort of taking that atmospherically captured carbon, but in plant form, and then putting that deep underground. I would say that one way, sometimes I think it's helpful to think about this stuff is thinking about taking carbon from the short-term carbon cycle of plants continuously sucking up carbon, decomposing, re-releasing it, and sort of doing that naturally. That's sort of a natural short-term cycle. And rocks do that, soil does that, plants, a lot of natural functions do that already. And sort of taking carbon from that short-term re-release cycle into the long duration cycle, right? Where we're sort of actually taking it and putting it deep underground where it's not going to come back out for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. That is the original cycle we disrupted with fossil fuel production, right? Because we actually went all the way down into the deep stuff.
Down and pulled it back up and released it.
And so
out.
we're sort of putting it down underground and taking it from that short term to that long term. And that to me is sort of that active, permanent carbon removal that we're doing.
Put another way, you have this persistent feedstock of carbon supply, which is natural, which is plants are capturing CO2 and generating it. And historically, it would just get re-released to the atmosphere. Now you can take it, capture it, and put it way back down underground where the dinosaurs and the dinosaur era plants had been permanently stored until humans released them back up. And so you could think of it as a one-for-one trade-off of the type of carbon that humans have pulled out of the ground and put back up in the atmosphere. So from that perspective, atoms to atoms, you're not taking something out of the atmosphere and putting it underground. But in a carbon accounting perspective, it's quite similar to think of it that way.
I think that's fair. And the other thing I would say is we do that direct measurement. Again, like we look at the waste and we say, take it to the lab and we say, what's the carbon sample? And we do multiple lab analyses every day of operation. So we're really looking at what's the carbon content. We use that for the math, right, of sort of the carbon removal. Obviously, when it would have gone back out to decompose into, let's say, a landfill or been land applied, it's primarily decomposing into methane. And I would just point out, like, the way we do the math is we don't credit for that avoided methane at all. So we're not doing that sort of like really complex math of what would have happened if it had avoided like this percent methane or that. To your point, I try to avoid as much hypothetical math as possible and just look at what can we measure to put that into our carbon removal.
So you're basically ultimately getting paid to put it back where oil used to be and sort of think about returning more carbon underground, which humans have sucked out of the ground.
Yeah.
And then from a pricing perspective, then in theory, it shouldn't be more expensive than a ton of oil getting pulled out of the ground. I would guess you're nowhere near that level of pricing expense. You got to come in below that, I would think.
That's an interesting way of framing it. I would say generally how I think about sort of our costing, especially I'm thinking more on sort of the carbon removal peers, right? If I think about other carbon removal players that do geologic sequestration, and I think, to your point, you can do a lot of things with carbon of sort of places to permanently store it. But if we think about putting it back underground, which is where the majority of this excess carbon came from with fossil fuel production, we put it deep underground. There's a lot of capacity down there. But if you do that and you're not us, you generally need to get it in a pure gas or pure liquid form. And so when we think about like a direct air capture, you mentioned those big fans, you're taking it, you're compressing it, you generally get into supercritical form, you put that deep underground. That can be a couple $1,000s a ton right now. Or you are doing what some of our other peers do, where you're taking the plant captured, that lower cost capture mechanism, because photosynthesis doesn't charge you.
And doesn't need to burn natural gas to power your operations.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. Plants really have it good in some ways. They're very efficient. Basically taking that sort of that waste biomass, but then pyrolyzing, right? Or using hydrothermal liquefaction to get to that bio oil, to get to that liquid and putting that underground. The key of Vaulted, right, is because we can take solids, we can take relatively unprocessed organic waste, right? So we can take that organic waste, that sludgy organic waste. We do very minimal processing, right? I'm talking like grinding, mixing, straining, filtering, that kind of stuff. So no low heat, very little energy consumption, off the shelf stuff, and sort of really minimal processing really can take that and put it underground because we're not trying to process the waste to get to the pure gas or the pure liquid. And that's where the slurry injection unlock comes in because it means that we just get to skip a big processing chunk of costs. And it also means that we can take these sort of sludgy organic waste, right? Again, these biosolids, manures, anything that's moisture intensive. A lot of other of our peers don't want those types of waste, right? If we think about BECs, if we think about other types of bikers, if we think about even like general interest for like biomass for SAF, right? For sustainable aviation fuel. In general, a lot of those pathways need dry waste and relatively homogeneous waste because they're doing some sort of combustion on them or some sort of process using heat. And so for them to use our type of waste, they'd have to dewater it and make it more homogeneous and probably depathogenize it, which is really expensive.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's got to be a huge pathogenic component to what you do, I would think.
Yeah, exactly. But so just for me, that means also that like we can get paid to take some of our waste, which I mentioned. We get paid a tipping fee for some of them, but also just means that we don't have as much competition for that biomass. There's actually like waste disposal markets for a lot of these wastes.
Is the carbon content relatively consistent?
It is for like per supplier. So if we think about this specific feedlot or this specific wastewater treatment facility, we're seeing fairly consistent carbon contents coming out of those. But obviously, you know, everyone has their own treatment process. So if it went through anaerobic digestion or it didn't, we take end of life waste. So if you have AD, great, we'll take it after the anaerobic digester. We'll take that post-digestion sludge. But depending on sort of the process in that specific facility, we'll see differences in carbon content between them, which is really why we run that math I talked through in the first place of like, what's the carbon content? How far away is it? What's the counterfactual? And we sort of run that through before we decide to take a new waste.
Okay, back to the top of our episode. How did Hutchinson, Kansas come about?
So we were incredibly lucky as a company. Again, we're under a year old, but because we're a spinoff, we basically inherited a mature, de-risked technology from all of Advantek's decade of work on the subsurface and slurry injection side, but we also inherited Kansas, a well facility in Hutchinson. This is a really interesting site. It's actually a network of salt caverns. So it's a network of 50 plus salt caverns. And that site...
I have to bring some Hutchinson trivia to the group. Hutchinson's salt mine underground has been a long time. I'm going to bring LA and Hutchinson together again.
Oh, wow.
A long time store of many valuable Hollywood archives, including the original film for The Wizard of Oz, stored underground because it's dry.
Yes, and something from Star Wars too, right? There's some really...
Oh boy, you've now surpassed my Hutchinson trivia knowledge.
There's like a famous Star Wars memorabilia. I don't know. Don't fact check me on that. Don't quote me on that.
All good.
Something from Star Wars is down there. But the cool thing is about that is it's basically they store really kind of important stuff down there to show how durable things that go down there are, right? Of like how safe kind of that as a storage mechanism is, which is sort of interesting.
By the way, the high school mascot for Hutchinson High, just for another fun fact, is the Salt Hawks.
Oh,
so there you go.
Okay, I love it.
It's like a Jayhawk, but it's a Salt Hawk.
I love it. The short answer is we inherited that site from Advantek, and they had already, so lucky, they had already sort of gone through, my co-founder Omar had already gone through that process of permitting it with KDHE. Again, we're fully regulated. So that state level EPA, KDHE helped us permit it for a class 5 sort of organics permit. And so when we, spun Vaulted off, we were able to sort of flip on that site as a permanent carbon removal facility and audited by Asymmetric within a couple months. We ended up doing like 2,000 tons within the first couple months of operation, which I'm really excited about, right? Because the whole industry has done like something like 25, 30,000 tons ever. And so for me, I'm all about like, we have this mature tech, we have these 2 sites that are operational and permitted, like we should just be absolutely running, focus on speed and scale with quality in mind, but again, fully audited by Asymmetric to sort of get as many tons of carbon in the ground as quickly as possible.
And so I'm going to guess correct me if I'm wrong, Los Angeles, you said, is primarily or heavily municipal waste, treated sewage waste, et cetera, that you're putting underground. I'm guessing Kansas is a lot of agricultural waste and, whether that's animal or crop that you're then injecting as slurry. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's a good mix. So right now we're doing primarily sort of diverted landfill waste, which is sort of mixed woody diverted landfill waste. And then, have contracted with a number of feedlots, so more manure, livestock waste, and then biosolids as well, and then hopefully a paper mill in the near future too. So Kansas is really also our well where we're able to, make sure that we can take each one of those kind of sludgy wastes and go through that learning process. Again, it's a standalone well, so piecing in together from sort of that local area waste.
Are you able to reverse the economics for these waste providers? Like normally they're paying a tipping fee to get somebody to get the stuff off their hands. Do they still pay you a tipping fee in addition to the credits that you're earning? Or have you flipped the economics back to their direction where they're participating in the carbon removal side of things?
It really depends on sort of the waste provider. So sometimes we'll pay to take the waste, even if it's, let's say, they're not doing anything productive with it, but they just spray it on the backfield, like with manure. Oftentimes they'll just sort of spray it on the backfield. And so even though they wouldn't really pay you to take it, but they obviously want a bit of, that cash for the hauling and the loading costs and sort of all that. So it depends on the specific waste provider of what that looks like. But in general, I would say for the waste that we do get paid for, those are generally wastes that have, again, sort of a waste disposal market already. And they generally tend to be either more pathogenic or more heavily regulated, right? So biosolids, for example, you cannot just spread that wherever you want. So the EPA's regulations, because it is more contaminated. But even if we think about like hormones and manure, EPA is also sort of increasingly looking at really groundwater testing because over-application of manure around feedlots is obviously a massive issue, right? That's where we get groundwater contamination and algae blooms and nutrient runoff and all that kind of stuff. And then even like sort of the contaminants in paper sludge, for example. So in general, if you're paying to send it to a landfill because of regulation, we will think about, how do we help you maybe lower your disposal fees as a way to be enticing for our waste partners. But really, there's other components as well, too, right? Because it's also how do we help you lower your liability? A lot of the waste partners that we partner with, especially sort of the larger integrated ones, have litigation, have liability of how they're disposing of their waste. And if they're contaminated, if there's PFAS, we're seeing a number of lawsuits. So we can sort of say, hey, we'll take full ownership of that waste. We'll take liability. We'll make sure something really safe is done with it. And again, fully regulated by the EPA to do that. So we're helping you lower your liability. We're also helping you get in front of regulation. So as we see increasing regulation in the waste space against land application of biosolids is becoming sort of more of a thing at the state level. So if you can't land apply it, then you only send it to landfills. Or if we think about, again, that crackdown on groundwater testing around feedlots. So we're also helping waste players sort of get ahead of regulation and have an alternative disposal mechanism at their fingertips that's not just sending it to the landfill, because landfills tend to be fairly expensive. And that's even going up because organics tend to create the largest issue in landfills. It's the biggest cause of leachate, right? And obviously those methane emissions. And so a lot of landfills don't want organics, which just means that tipping fee for organics and landfills goes up. So it's really, for them, it's, waste partners, it's a way to maybe lower your disposal fees, but also limit your liability, get ahead of regulation, get to your zero landfill goals, that holistic package when we work with them.
We haven't talked about your Frontier deal yet, and huge congrats on that. Let's talk about that. I'm going to get into that by asking you a little bit of a weird question, which is for these waste providers in Kansas that are dealing with cow manure or some sort of EPA regulated PFAS disposal, if they knew that they were paying some company who has nearly $60 million carbon removal deal from Silicon Valley companies, including Facebook and whatnot, to take this off their hands, would those dynamics be different than they are today? Like, could it create a weirdness with the companies that you work with?
It's a good question, but I would say in general, they all know that we are a carbon removal company. Anyone that goes to our website is going to figure it out pretty quick. So it's not a secret. And in general, I don't think having secrets is a good way to build a business in the long term. So it's more of trying to find those waste partners that understand that the reason that we can give them a lower disposal option that also does all those things I mentioned is because, there is another market sort of willing to pay for that environmental benefit that we bring. And so I think a lot of our waste partners are actually quite excited about it because for years, let's think about in the Advantek mind, we were like, oh, we're going to charge you more for this disposal mechanism that's good on all these other benefits, but it's going to cost more than the alternative. And so I think in some ways they're quite excited to say, hey, you can give us all this on liability and, zero landfill and good for the environment, and you can do it potentially at a cost savings. To me, that's a real partnership I'd want to be a part of.
Yeah, and I ask that question with no opinion. I ask it as someone who grew up in Kansas and am trying to think about local businesses having their models change in some way, shape, or form because of a venture-backed tech startup that is swimming in Silicon Valley circles. It's just so not what any of these companies are used to working with that I would imagine it opens up conversations that you're having to navigate in some kind of way that you maybe weren't thinking about necessarily when you entered those markets, or maybe you were, I don't know.
No, it's a good one. And I would also say that we think about it from not only a cost perspective, right? Of how much could we pay to take this waste or how much could we get paid? We're again always thinking about it from a quality perspective. So on the protocol, we have to be on this sort of really, I call it conscientious edge, right? Where we can't pay too much for the waste. So we're actually confined by how much we can pay per ton because we, again, can't incentivize the production of waste. So you could think about in some theory, if we paid thousands of tons per, ton of manure, you could potentially incentivize more cattle on that feedstock, right? Which I don't think any of us want. So it's really we're hamstrung from a quality perspective on making sure we're not paying too much. And we also can't get paid too much because we always are financially additional, right? So we have to ensure that operation wouldn't have happened without the carbon monetization. So we're sort of always on that conscientious edge, making sure that we're sort of walking that line correctly from a quality perspective, and then also making sure, obviously, that the economics can work.
Okay, share more about the Frontier deal and how that came about, and maybe give us the specifics of it.
Well, I'm really excited to share on the Frontier deal. And it's actually, one isn't public yet, so I can't say the full thing, but we basically have on the waste side, we've signed quite a large partnership with one quite large integrated waste management company in the US. We'll come out with that probably later this summer, but that's for sort of 8 wells across the US, sort of these co-located wells.
Wow.
It's a big one. And I think for us, it really proves that the incumbent waste industry wants to work with us, that there's sort of a win-win on that value proposition and that partnership. And that's for, some biosolids as well. So some ability to get paid to take waste. So I think that's really exciting on sort of the waste side. And then on the carbon side, Frontier, is obviously such a wonderful buyer in the space. People probably know it's actually 10 buyers, right? So some large tech companies, some large financial institutions put together $1 billion to commit towards permanent carbon removal purchases. They were our first customer. So they actually gave us a pre-purchase, a $500,000 check in right at the time we were spinning off. So I guess fall last year. And we delivered that. I think it was the largest and fastest delivery of a pre-purchase by Frontier. So we delivered that in January. So kind of got that going when the site turned on. And that was really the catalyst for them because, I think they're really looking for high quality, again, permanent, measurable quality carbon removal to come in and really, but they wanted to offtake it from companies that could deliver in the short term and that they felt comfortable that they could actually meet their delivery goals for some of this larger tonnage. And so then we sort of worked with them quite quickly to sort of put that offtake together. It ended up being a $58.3 million offtake between now and 2027, so the next 3.5 years roughly, for just over 150,000 tons of CDR. As you can imagine, for us, that's huge, right? Because not only is that a great stamp on sort of the quality piece, I think Frontier is one of the highest quality buyers in the market, but it also just means that we have that really nice sort of bridge on the revenue side that we know we can get paid a fair price per ton to do the work in the short term.
Last question for me is you also are one of the, is it finalists or semi-finalists for this large X Prize carbon removal competition that's going on with a number of other sort of, as you mentioned, or called them OG carbon removal companies or whatnot. You're one of the new kids on the block in the mix of a number of names that we've had on the pod and we've all heard of. Tell us a little bit more about that process and that competition and how it's going.
I'm really excited. I think May was the month of carbon removal lists is what I've been calling it. Between X Prize, Top 20, and then also DOE came out with sort of their top 24 semifinalists. Really excited that we're on both. Kind of blown away, but really excited by it. So for X Prize, really interesting competition, right? So it's sort of this $100 million competition for doing durable carbon removal and sort of proving that out. And so we've been in that process for a while where I think I'm actually forgetting the exact phase we're in, but we're, kicking off site visits. And so we're sort of doing that deeper level of diligence. For X Prize, I think it's such a cool way to think about stimulating the market And sort of that top winner will get, right? So $50 million. I guess in theory, we've got a 1 in 20 chance of winning $50 million.
Pretty good odds.
Sure. And there's some amount of cash for the runner-ups. But then also on the DOE side, I'm really excited about that one, obviously, because it's just so incredible to have a stamp from the US government saying, we, in general, like this. It's safe and it has high efficacy and it can scale and it can get to low cost. And so just having that stamp, I think, is huge. You know this, but for permanent carbon removal markets, buyers on the voluntary side buy CDR because they're looking for that real delta in quality, right? They're saying, I can't be in that Guardian article about the fake deforestation or whatever it is. So I'm really going to pay up, like really up, hundreds of dollars a ton when I could pay $1 for that logo, for that quality associated logo. And so I'm just having the US government say like, hey, this is quality. I think it's huge for catalyzing sort of the voluntary market as well as the direct government purchasing one.
I have one other question since we've talked about government. As far as I understand it, the type of methodology that you use today does not qualify for like 45Q or any of the kind of tax benefits from the Inflation Reduction Act. Is that accurate? Or are there things that you're able to take advantage of there too?
That is accurate. Yeah. So we're not under 45Q today, though we're definitely, having those conversations with a lot of our peers, because I think a lot of us feel that 45Q should be more tech agnostic. If you sort of hold durability and measurability and quality constant, then hopefully expanding that out to be more tech agnostic is where we want to go. But you're correct. Today, we're not under that.
And there's some groups, I think, like Carbon Removal Alliance and others that are maybe helping to advance some of those conversations. Is that correct?
That's right. And we're in the CRA and really happy to be there. So part of those groups.
That's great. All right. What should I have asked, or what else should we make sure we cover?
When I think about Vaulted at scale, sort of what we could do really as we go more global, sort of outside of the US, we have these really strong benefits for, local environments and for local communities. When we even think about scaling up in the US, I think that's helpful, not just in sort of having more impact, but also helpful in terms of working with local communities, community engagement work, permitting work, where we can really come in and say, hey, we can help you clean up your groundwater. We can help limit sort of this stuff going back out into your drinking water, right? All of that stuff. So I think that's really important. But also when I think globally, like I'm just going to pull out Nairobi as an example because I used to live there for so many years. And I saw this firsthand. In a city like Nairobi, there's a wastewater treatment facility. It's 2 hours outside of town. It charges a tipping fee. So 2% of human waste gets to that wastewater treatment facility. Almost nothing goes there, as you can imagine. Who's taking on that cost? And so, most of that waste, 90+% of human waste in a city like Nairobi gets illegally dumped directly into the Nairobi River. And that river is the main source of bathing water and drinking water for especially lower income populations, especially slum populations, which are around the river in the city. That is a huge human health issue, right? That's a huge development issue, like water and sanitation. If we think about leading causes of death, especially among children, being cholera, diarrhea, other waterborne illnesses. Not to get too dark, but it's really a strong part of, I think, both Omar and I's missions of, yes, we want to fight climate change and do that through carbon removal, but our carbon removal also can really have a dent in helping to clean up and helping sort of solve some of these infrastructure challenges in emerging markets, and also sort of having a real impact on human health and development side as well. So that's not today, that's not in Kansas and RLA, but as we think, and we're thinking seriously about global scale in the near term, we're really excited to work with cities and communities where we could have that sort of impact as well.
It'd be interesting to think about expanding to those other geographies that maybe don't have the type of stringency that the EPA brings, and your ability not only to divert some of the waste that you talked about, but to maybe also even help the regulatory environments in those locations get formed in some places.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, there's a lot of work there, right, on the existing waste infrastructure, and then also sort of the regulatory side on subsurface work. Some countries have that more built out than others. So we're really looking at, when we think about expansion, we think about getting new wells online, we didn't even really talk about this, but most of the team is focused on getting new wells online.
I'm sure. Yeah, have to be. Yeah.
That's most of what we do. And that's always looking at where's the good geology with that good containment, that basin structure we talked about. Where's the good waste? So where's waste that has high carbon content, isn't being used productively, is close to those well sites? And then where's the good regulatory? And it's really that three-pronged Venn diagram. And we're looking for where can we permit safely and legally? Where can we get that waste? And then where can we have that geology. And then we're sort of looking county by county in the US now, but also if we think globally, we can think about countries that have that as well, right? So countries that have subsurface regulation and have a lot of waste and have the right geology and sort of go from there as we scale it.
Julie, any calls to action for anyone who's listening, intrigued by what you're doing? I don't know what kind of roles you're hiring for right now or anything else like that you might want to shout out.
3 things. So one is if you work at a large company that has net zero goals or, carbon neutral goals, and you're curious about buying carbon removal, we'd love to talk to you. I mean, we sold a good chunk to Frontier, but we're definitely not sold out. So we're still we got more capacity to sell in the near term too. So if you're a carbon removal buyer, if you're at a company that has organic waste or touches organic waste, we didn't really talk about this either, but we work with a lot of not just like large integrated waste players, but even players in food and agriculture, players that touch maybe some of these sectors that have larger amounts of organic waste, paper industry, for example, and you're curious about lowering your disposal fees and lowering your liability and being part of carbon removal. We're always looking for new partners on the waste side. And then we are hiring. All of our sort of jobs are online posted. I would say the newest one I just posted this morning is I'm personally looking for a junior chief of staff here in San Francisco for sort of a younger career professional. And we're also looking for a head of communications and marketing. So those are kind of 2 top of mind jobs.
Well, Julia, I appreciate you joining us today. Congrats on all the progress. It's amazing to see it, given what you said, the relative youth of the company, a testament, obviously, to the work you're doing. So congrats and can't wait to follow along.
Thanks for having me, Cody. This was super fun. Appreciate it.
Thanks again for joining us on the My Climate Journey podcast.
At MCJ Collective, we're all about powering collective innovation for climate solutions by breaking down silos and unleashing problem-solving capacity.
If you'd like to learn more about MCJ Collective, visit us at mcjcollective.com. And if you have a guest suggestion, let us know that via Twitter at MCJPod.
For weekly climate op-eds, jobs, community events, and investment announcements from our MCJ venture funds, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter on our website.
Thanks, and see you next episode.